I'm Katie Lannan, in for Adam Riley. Tonight on Talking Politics, local cities and towns are scrambling to find enough shelter for the influx of migrants coming into the state. Can Massachusetts keep up with demand? Plus, as Mitt Romney plans his Senate exit, we'll look back at his legacy in Massachusetts, in Washington, and in the Republican Party. Is there still room for his brand of republicanism in the GOP? But first, some stunning results in the race for Boston City Council. Incumbents Ricardo Arroyo and Kendra Lara, both mired in controversy in recent months, came in third in this week's preliminary elections and won't appear on the ballot in November. It's the first time incumbent councilors have been booted out in the preliminaries in at least 40 years. So what does this signal from voters? And who has the best chance to win the two open spots in November? To discuss, I'm joined by Lisa Kashinsky, author of Politico's Massachusetts Playbook, and Jennifer Smith, a reporter for Commonwealth magazine. They're also both co-hosts of the Horse Race Politics podcast. Lisa, Jennifer, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks for having us.
And
absolute pleasure.
Lisa, I want to start with you because you were actually on hand at Kendra Lara's campaign event on Tuesday night when we found out that she wasn't going to advance past the preliminary. What was the mood like there?
It was a small gathering, and I think the mood, folks, quite honestly, were shocked. They knew the problems, kind of the fallout from the car crash that Kendra Lara was facing, and they still expected her to at least get through to the general election. There was a lot of emotion that night from, this really kind of core group of supporters who I believe were there, and really just believed in Kendra as an effective messenger for the progressive movement, and had known her and seen her work for years, and were really just kind of devastated to know that she wouldn't be, potentially advancing to a second term.
Mm-hmm. And in the days since Tuesday's election, Jennifer, you've been reporting on how Boston Mayor Wu reacted, what she had to say about it this week. What did the mayor and maybe some of the other political power players in Boston's progressive and broader circles have to say about this?
I've been following specifically the progressive politicians because for one reason or another, this election has been framed as essentially a referendum on the state of progressivism in Boston. So Mayor Michelle Wu, when asked about this, essentially made a fairly, I think, reasonable point that both of the candidates who actually came out on top in both of these races also, as she put it, define themselves as progressives in the way that many people would define her as a progressive, specifically saying they're trying to bring about needed change, wanting to be in a progressive agenda and pushing kind of for what's needed and not settling for the way things have been done. So Michelle Wu didn't, for instance, speak directly about being happier than anyone might expect that her endorsed candidate, Enrique Pepin, came out on top in District 5, but again, was talking about it sort of in terms of if you came out and you were looking for a progressive candidate, it seems that progressive candidates did end up coming out on top. You also saw some basically very, very elated response from former city councilor and now state senator Lydia Edwards, who said that she was very excited that this demonstrated that people were able to make a choice to both have a progressive candidate and also steer away from some of the interpersonal drama and kind of political chaos that has seemed to consume the council of late.
Yeah, let me stick with you for a second because I want to talk about what this does mean for the council, which we've seen kind of mired in its own drama in a lot of instances throughout the past several months. What do these two losses mean for the council, both demographically and in terms of its political factions?
That's a great question, and it kind of depends on who you ask, because many of the anxieties around this race did involve those two questions. From one perspective, of course, Kendra Lara's loss means that the council will be losing a Black woman, a young Black woman who is, of course, openly a socialist, and replacing her with either an IT director in William King, who is also a Black man, or Ben Weber, who is a labor attorney, but would be a white man that would be entering the council. in District 5, they would be replacing Ricardo Arroyo with one of two other Latino men. So demographically, there's a bit of a switch up that we might be expecting. Ideologically, and this is really important, of course, is the city council is objectively more progressive and more left-leaning than it has ever been in its history. And that means that you've seen essentially a four-person, very progressive bloc that includes both of the now ousted incumbents and also Councilor Julia Mejia and Councilor Tanya Fernandez Anderson, as opposed to a more moderate or conservative bloc that you can also see with often mostly white Irish councilors, though not in its entirety. And so these blocs do kind of move around with a sort of general liberal, somewhat progressive center. It looks like there's a possibility, depending on if the progressives end up winning and making it through, that you might see more of a boosting out of that middle block, which is fairly liberal, but doesn't, for instance, identify itself as a very, very left-leaning block.
Right. Interesting. And Lisa, when we're talking about these three, or the city council preliminary, before it happened, Councilor Tanya Fernandez Anderson's race was kind of grouped in with the Lara and Arroyo seats as one to watch. Like Arroyo, she admitted to an ethics violation, and she's another outspoken progressive. What was different about her race that she made it through?
And quite frankly, it was just the kind of caliber of the candidates, so to speak, with that race. She was facing, most prominently two kind of perennial also ran candidates, one of whom had made it onto the council before, but they were, kind of more more conservative leaning and just weren't really running, kind of the more mainstream campaign that the challengers against Kendra Lara and Ricardo Arroyo were.
So where did the progressives, the organizations, the advocates, the regular citizens and voters who were with Arroyo and Lara, where did they go from here?
I think that's the question that a lot of those folks, and kind of specifically the folks within JP Progressives and Progressive West Roxbury and Roslindale, which are two of the Boston chapters of Progressive Massachusetts, that had really stuck behind these two candidates, and Kendra in particular. That's something that they're grappling with right now, because there are progressive candidates in this final, but they, for various reasons, were not the candidates that were endorsed by these groups. And I think it's kind of a split or a splintering among progressives in Boston to decide, kind of, do they want to go all in for these candidates right now? And that, remains to be seen as they kind of grapple with the fallout of what exactly happened on Tuesday.
One of many things we'll have to watch as we head into the fall election season. And Jennifer, if I can ask you, you mentioned the kind of different blocks on the faction. We did not see any of those more moderate or conservative, however you want to define it, councilors lose, like we did with a couple of high-profile progressives. Is there anything to read into that?
Well, one of the reasons that they didn't lose is because some of them weren't, in fact, running. Councilor Frank Baker, who is considered kind of perhaps the counterpoint to sort of chaos on the liberal side of the council, has often been kind of at the center of some of the interpersonal and interpolitical disputes on the council. He announced that he was not going to be running for re-election. So in District 3, the race was actually considering whether or not his sort of chosen replacement, John Fitzgerald, who was also backed by Mayor Marty Walsh, would be making it through. He did indeed. He was handily the top vote getter. And ultimately, he is going to have to face, in the general election in November, a teacher and also socialist-affiliated Joel Richards, who might actually end up being where a lot of the kind of progressive organizing power ends up going after the District 5 and District 6 losses.
Excellent. So lots to watch for as we head into the fall. Lisa, quickly, how much can we expect Boston Mayor Wu to be involved in the next stage of the elections here?
Well, she'll definitely continue to be heavily involved in District 5, where she went on the doors, and her kind of campaign apparatus really went hard for Enrique Pepin just in this preliminary. You could expect to see her there. It's an open question how involved, if at all, she'll get in District 6 to back Ben Weber there if she chooses to do that. She does have other candidates she's backing kind of in the at-large race, Henry Santana. So it will definitely be interesting to see who she chooses to endorse, who she doesn't choose to endorse, and how hard she campaigns in each of these different races for those candidates.
Excellent. A lot of things to keep watching, both in the fall and when the new council takes its seats next year. Absolutely. Lisa Kashinsky, Jenn Smith, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Next up, the migrant crisis in Massachusetts seems to be getting worse before it can get better. Governor Maura Haley has now deployed hundreds of National Guard members to help emergency shelters handle the overwhelming influx of families who need a place to stay. Cities and towns are struggling to find places to house the migrants coming into their communities, which they're legally required to do by the state's Right to Shelter Act. Now, as GBH News' Sarah Betancourt reports, some cities and towns are calling on the state to do more. Sarah joins me now to discuss, as does Emanuela Renee, the coordinator for the Association for Haitian Women in Boston's Task Force for Newly Arrived Haitians. Haitians make up a majority of the population of migrants coming into Massachusetts. Emanuela, Sarah, thank you so much for being here today to walk through this.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
And Sarah, I want to start by talking about some of the reporting you've done recently. You reached out to, something like 36 towns and cities to hear from officials there about what they're experiencing. What are some of the themes you heard in those conversations?
So it was about 40 mayors and municipal leaders. The overwhelming sense that I got from them was, it was really threefold. One, we want to be welcoming to new arrivals, new immigrants. Two, we feel like there hasn't been enough communication from the state on who's coming, when they're coming. And third, that there's not enough support, enough resources to help them. And those were like the three things they really wanted to address in their interviews.
Yeah, and one of the mayors you talked to, I think, referenced the flights that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis sent up here. We're coming up the 1 year anniversary, or we are just at the 1 year anniversary of those migrants arriving on Martha's Vineyard as part of that trip. Do you feel that how do you see, or what's different about, that high profile situation and what's happening now with the state sending people into these communities?
I mean, the similarity is that there's the element of surprise and little communication. However, what Governor Ron DeSantis did was a political stunt, using people's lives, sending them somewhere where they did not know they were going. Whereas what the state is doing under the required 1983 Right to Shelter law is sending people to communities in hotels that are state contracted and having them stay there until they can figure out what's next for them. So it's a little bit different. But some mayors and town managers felt the similarities were significant.
And we should note that Right to Shelter law, too. It's about families, right? So these are people with children, pregnancies, so not just...
And with the 6,800 families that are in shelters right now in Massachusetts, about a third-ish are in hotels that are state contracted. But a lot of them are unhoused residents and migrant families. So that's an important delineation to make.
Right, it's happening while we already have a housing crisis in the state. Emanuela, I'd love to hear from you about what kind of work your organization is doing and what you're seeing on the ground.
Right, so the Association of Haitian Women has long had a history of helping Haitian immigrants in Boston. And so we found that it was our responsibility to help the newly arrived Haitian community find their footing and get resources. So we coordinated a task force for newly arrived Haitians. It's made up of 8 committees, including social services, healthcare, mental health, education, and so on. And we're really working to set up a system where newly arrivals can get the resources that they need to live fulfilling and dignified lives in Massachusetts.
So what does that look like? What kind of services and supports do people need when they get here?
They need the same supports that people who live here have. So they need access to work. Their kids need school. They need access to food. They need essentially the same basic human rights that other citizens of the United States have. So we try to, right now, like mentioned, the migrants are staying in shelters. So we're trying to reach out to these shelters and see what they need and how they can be better supported. I've had the opportunity to visit one of these shelters in Framingham and tell them that the National Guard is now coming to assist in finding them transportation and food, and they will not be armed. So I made sure to tell them that. And one of the main issues that we have there is a lack of translation and interpretation for these Haitian migrants, like lack of culturally competent care. So we're kind of addressing the issues as they come up because, like mentioned, this is extremely unprecedented and poorly prepared for.
Right. Now let's talk about the National Guard for a second. That's one of the things Governor Haley has done. She's sending them out to shelters where there aren't service providers already contracted. Sarah, what other kinds of things is the state doing to handle this?
So the National Guard members are going to about 36 state contracted hotels that don't have the service providers. And what service providers typically do there is help enroll with mass health, provide basic food and needs. A lot of the women have young children, are pregnant, so having diapers and other necessities like that readily available. They help with enrollment in schools, local school districts, which is a pretty significant thing for a lot of these small towns. It pretty much runs the gamut, helping them find long-term housing. Worcester's doing that right now, and service providers in the hotels there. It really ranges.
Yeah, so there's a lot being done at, I guess, kind of the state level, the local level, the non-governmental level. For the states and the cities that, the state and the cities that are hosting new arrivals now, what is the price tag on all of this, Sarah?
It ranges pretty significantly. A lot of people told me, I don't really know what the price tag is yet because often they haven't known when people are arriving. Like in Norton, for instance, the town manager there said, I wasn't aware that there were more unhoused families and migrant families coming here until my clerk got 3 birth certificate requests for that hotel. And then I did a little digging and figured it out. And from there, he was able to put together a coalition and figure out, like, oh, how can local community members and town members assist? But it's all sort of in the preliminary stages. Something that did pop up a lot in interviews was something I had never thought of. Room taxes for shelters and hotels. Usually hotels give a room tax to the municipality, but because there's a state contract and these hotels are almost entirely going to unhoused families, a lot of the town managers are like, well, we're not getting the room tax now. The state counters that, but it's still all in the works. They're hoping for reimbursement, and they just want to make sure that some of the funds they were typically getting from hotels still come to support municipalities.
Right, and Governor Haley is seeking some more money from the state legislature to help defray this as well.
Yes, and she and Boston Mayor Wu were able to get about $2 million back in August as well to support the crisis, specifically for housing and EA shelters.
Okay, so there's a lot of different pieces here and components of the whole things and things to watch as it goes forward, and certainly work being done outside of government as well, right? You must all have your hands full.
Yeah, it is extremely exhaustive, and we're seeing a lot of social services bearing the weight of it all. However, it is work that needs to be done now that these families have arrived here. So we're at AFA, we are happy to serve our Haitian community.
All right, Emanuela, Sarah, thank you so much for talking about this with me, and we hope to hear from you again. Utah Senator, former Massachusetts governor, and 2012 presidential nominee Mitt Romney has announced he will not seek re-election in 2024.
I considered my age and the fact that at the end of a second term, I would be in my mid-80s, and I think it's time for guys like me to get out of the way and have people in the next generation step forward.
And of course, the age of politicians has been a cause for concern lately. But age isn't the only political obstacle the 76-year-old Republican would face. There was also the threat of a primary challenge against Romney, who faced more than a little backlash from his own party for standing up to Donald Trump. Is there still room in the GOP for politicians like Romney? Or is the so-called Massachusetts Republican a thing of the past? I'm joined by Glenn Johnson, who covered Romney with the Associated Press and the Boston Globe. He's also author of Window Seat on the World, an inside account of the 4 years he spent working for Secretary of State John Kerry. Glenn, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Katie.
So I introduced you a little bit, but I'd love it if you could run down for me just how long and in what context you've covered Mitt Romney.
Well, from the beginning of his tenure as governor, in fact, even before, I was working in the Globe's Washington bureau back in at the time of the Salt Lake Olympics, and pitched to an editor going out to Salt Lake City and seeing if I could confront him about these rumors that he was thinking about coming back to Massachusetts and challenging Jane Swift and running for the Republican nomination. I got the green light, flew out there, chased him around for a couple days, and finally, over dinner that he and his wife Ann were having in his office at the Olympic complex, got him to talk a little bit about why he might run, and actually had Ann Romney almost blurt out that they were going to run. That became the opening anecdote for the story that ultimately was written about it. Fast forward to him the whole 4 years that he served as governor, through the tunnel ceiling collapse, the whole ramp up to his campaign to run for president, which virtually started the day that he became governor, and then on to the floor of the convention hall when he was nominated to be the Republican national presidential candidate. So it's been a big sweep, and then an element and a moment in there when we had a famous, infamous confrontation on a Staples floor down in Greenville, South Carolina as well. So the whole sweep of his time as governor.
We actually, I think, have a clip of that infamous confrontation you mentioned there.
Yeah. That was, it was sort of people seeing the sausage being made of running for president, but it kind of got at one of the characteristics of Mitt Romney, which was near duplicity, where he would say something but act another way. He ran for governor of Massachusetts as a fiscal Republican and as a fiscal conservative and a sort of social liberal. And as soon as he became governor, shifted course. And that kind of has been a hallmark of his career as both a presidential candidate and now as a senator.
I think we can play that clip as well
Sure.
to just illustrate what you're talking about there.
I don't have lobbyists running my campaign. I don't have lobbyists that are tied to my...
That is not true. Ron Kaufman is a lobbyist. How can you say that you don't have a lobbyist?
Did you hear what I said? Did you hear what I said, Glenn?
You don't have lobbyists running your campaign?
I said I don't have lobbyists running my campaign, and he's not running my campaign.
One of your senior advisors.
He's an advisor, and the person who runs my campaign is Beth Myers, and I have a whole staff of deputy campaign managers.
There's window dressing. He's a potted plant on your plane.
Ron is a wonderful friend and advisor. He's not paid. He's an advisor like many others. But I do not have lobbyists running my campaign.
So we can see there Mitt Romney willing to stand up to a reporter. Certainly, in recent years, he's emerged as someone who's willing to go up against members of his own party. Does that track with what he was like when he was governor here in Massachusetts?
Well, I mean, as governor of Massachusetts, he led a somewhat cloistered existence. When he became governor, up went the velvet ropes. Reporters couldn't walk into the governor's office complex. He had a reserved elevator to go in and out of the office. There was a lot of structure to it. Some of it made sense. All communication went through Eric Fernstrom, his communications director. So there was like a business-like atmosphere to the way the governor's office and the state government was run. But there was also, a prelude to what you could see later of him setting up a presidential run and his national sort of positions on things. And so as he became a national figure, he tracked a little bit differently than he had when he came into office in Massachusetts.
Interesting, yeah, and I imagine the dynamic's a little different having to work with the Democratic legislature here.
Right. I mean, he had a huge role in playing in passing universal health care for Massachusetts. And he went up on stage in Faneuil Hall and he signed that with Ted Kennedy standing there. And I remember Ted Kennedy telling the story later that John McCain, who foresaw Mitt as a potential presidential candidate and himself had presidential aspirations, McCain saying to Teddy before he left Washington to go up to the bill signing, make sure you hug Romney real tight, Teddy, because he wanted that picture of Mitt, the conservative Republican, ostensibly, with Teddy, the lion, liberal lion of the Senate. Yeah, very funny.
So one of the things I know I've been hearing the past couple of days as people react to, sure, Mitt Romney's saying it's time for a new generation, but he also, would he be able to make it through a primary? That's a lot of what people were saying when Charlie Baker announced that he wasn't going to seek another term of governor as governor here. Do you think there's still room in the Republican Party, in the political landscape writ large, for these kinds of, you know, Republicans that Massachusetts is so fond of electing as governor?
I think in Massachusetts, Charlie had a much different landscape and probably could have endured. But both at the state level and the national level, you have this very difficult situation where you have the extremes of both parties with a hammerlock on the primary process. And for a candidate to win elective office, they have to get through a primary. And so if you have to go very far to either the left or the right to win a nomination, it makes it harder to come to the center, which is where the balance of votes are for a general election. And so Charlie faced, this very, discordant, out of step Republican primary electorate that he probably could have gotten through, but had a stranglehold on the party leadership. Mitt, at a national level, and especially in a state like Utah, which is solidly Republican, was going to face a greater challenge. So it's kind of typical for him. There's a lot of reasons for him to want to leave now. He's 76. He's got millions in the bank. He has more grandchildren than you can count on two hands. And so there's a lot of reasons for him to want to step aside now. But the reality is he did face a difficult primary challenge. And so out of a challenge like that, he's seeking virtue. He's talking about the broader lessons about politicians knowing when it's time to step aside, and he's also avoiding the embarrassment of a potential primary loss. It's all very Mitt Romney.
That's great. Lot to work into that one announcement, I guess.
Yes.
Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time to run it down with us. I really appreciate it. That's it for tonight. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. You can find me on the website formerly known as Twitter. I'm at Katie Lannan. Adam is at Riley Adam. For now, thanks for watching and good night.